Engineering, Magic, and Kitsune, Ch.2. John froze when he saw her imposing figure through the open gate, towering over him with a malicious-looking toothy grin. The angle before made it hard to notice, but she must have had a foot and a half, or maybe even 2, on him, and the Kitsune was so close that she could reach out and touch him even without lunging. His attacker would already be upon him by the time he could bring his gauntlet up to defend himself, and his muscles tensed, prepared to fight for his life. He still had a trick or two up his sleeve. The towering fox stepped through the gate, giving him another shadow bow as she did, closing the door behind herself and hefting the bar back into place with no further prompting on his part. His heart thundered in his chest as he let go of a breath he didn't know he was holding. Right, everything was okay. He was just helping an unusual traveler who was actually willing to talk to him, and he got paranoid. That's it. He had already decided to afford her a bare minimum of trust, and stood by that choice, no matter what demons his hyperactive mind could conjure. He shook himself out of his stupor and gestured for her to follow him as he turned to walk away, ignoring an urge to constantly look over his shoulder at her giant figure, looming over him as she trailed a few respectful paces behind, almost silent as a whisper on the worn, cobbled path. Strange. He had heard her from rather far away on the gravel outside, right? A frown crept across his face. Sure, it was a different material, but even accounting for that, it was incongruous. Was that her way of announcing herself to the expected defenders of this place so she wasn't shot? John led Yuki to the secondary warehouse and slid the door open to let her go first. The Kitsune stooping low to fit through, carefully drawing her fanning tails inwards so as to not brush him or catch on the frame. Scanning the room, the attentive fox took in a myriad of sturdy shelves built over the grooves where low beds used to lie. Boxes, pots, boxes, bags, and more boxes lined each shelf, interspersed with sealed pots of various supplies and regions, with a wooden sign written in English on each section. Without a word, the man closed the door behind himself as he entered and strode to the third shelf on the right, grabbed a small sealed pot from the first tier, another from the third, and one last large cooking pot on the fourth before heading to the tap in the far corner. He filled the pot with water, grabbed some firewood and kindling from the shelf next to it, and tossed it into fuel into a nearby fire pit, lighting it with a quick point and gesture. He realized his error far too late. His eyes snapped to Yuki, but the Kitsune wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was thoroughly fixed on the faucet, staring as if she was trying to burn a hole through it. Slowly, haltingly, she walked over to it as if to get up and run away like a skittish cat. She crouched down, put a hand underneath, and opened the faucet, slightly jerking as the cool water poured down onto the black pads of her palm and down the drain. She turned it back off, then on, her brow furrowing, before cupping her hands to gather some and take a large drink. "I suppose you weren't expecting a tap," he honestly inquired, even though he felt stupid for asking like he expected an answer a moment later. Still, Yuki had surely seen this before. Even if indoor plumbing, in the modern sense, wasn't present in this land, it was not hard to rig up a decent well, some aqua-aligned enchantment work for plumbing, and a sand filter to deal with most of the contaminants, and some careful application of a bit of raw entropy-aligned magic to kill any leftover bacteria. All things considered, it was probably clean enough to use for wound cleaning without boiling it, but he wasn't risking it. She hesitantly tore her gaze away from the tap and back to him, giving him an ear flick that he couldn't even begin to decipher with a curious glint in her eye. Grabbing another sheet of paper, he wrote, "Please lie down. I want to tend your injury now," before drawing a picture of her lying on the ground and elevating her leg. It was a very, very poor drawing, admittedly. He blamed nerves. Mischief flashed across the Kitsune's expression, and she opened her mouth to respond before snapping her jaw shut with a small click, annoyance taking its place. With a quiet huff, she grabbed one of the spare bedrolls lying on her back and stuffing it under her injured leg. John mused that it was strange how much she trusted him as she washed his hands. Perhaps the damage affected her more than it seemed, and she didn't have a choice. Or even now she might be confident in her ability to defend herself, should he try something. A quick glance into those golden eyes revealed no hint as he settled by her side. Maybe the rules of hospitality were magically enforced in this land, and he had seen no mention of it for the same reason none would note the gravity made things go down. Regardless of the cause, it made it easier for him to do his duty. John shivered at the sight as he pulled the edge of her kimono back, the sickly sound of a half-stuck fabric pulling away from a wound and the smell of old, half-dried blood sending a chill up his spine. It was even worse close up. It didn't look infected, bizarrely, but the whole area pulsed dull red beneath thick layers of dried blood around the edges. The strips of cloth covering the site long since reached capacity and bled through. He popped open the first pot, withdrawing a pair of tweezers, various strips of fabric, and some alcohol for cleaning up outside the wound. It was mighty convenient that low-level bursts of unfocused entropy magic worked just as well for sterilizing sealed containers as for water. It was too big to stitch, so he left a needle and thread in the container and hesitantly unwrapped the bandage slowly and carefully to prevent the cut from bleeding anew. Again, as he unpacked the thoroughly used gauze, he reflected that she could have been dead. The wound was several inches deep and wide, just short of likely hitting bone. He was no doctor, but he was sure there should have been an artery here that led to her bleeding out in minutes at most, and even if by some miracle it stopped bleeding, everything below this point should have been dead by lack of blood flow. Never mind be something that she could walk on, yet still the great rend carved into her form wasn't bleeding. Below the now removed gauze, stones, dirt, and even a shard of copper were left behind, half pressed into the exposed skin. He cringed, looking over at the Kitsune, but she seemed unbothered. No, her golden-slitted eyes were firmly locked in his hands, watching with what appeared to be fascination without a hint of distress, even as she watched him grab the tweezers and reach into the tear. It had to be some sort of innate magic keeping her alive. There was no other explanation. He wouldn't be surprised if this wound care was all self-done, too, with how little she seemed to care for paltry things like debilitating pain. He reached in and started putting out debris piece by piece from the site, hands steadied to avoid scraping the sensitive flesh with the steel tweezers. It all came out quickly, easily. Even the pieces of stone embedded into her flesh were trivial to free with minimal effort, even if some spots started to bleed surprisingly lightly once the debris was removed. John supposed it was all part of the natural healing process, but this felt too easy. John knew that he shouldn't be thinking something like that when he was ostensibly saving a life, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this should feel like a desperate struggle to prevent her from bleeding out, instead of like cleaning out a scrape. He removed the now boiling water from the stove and left it to cool for a few minutes while he cleaned up the larger pieces, circling back around once he finished, and it cooled down to about lukewarm. Slowly, he poured the pot over the wound, ignoring the Kitsune's complete and utter lack of reaction aside from a slight twitch, and very gently used the cloth to clean any remaining dirt from the injury. Using the corner, he soaked in alcohol to clean up dried blood left around it and down Yuki's neck. Once satisfied, John grabbed a second jar, unsealing his secret weapon. It felt like gel in his hands, but it was almost entirely water, other than the pea-sized arcane focus embedded in its core that kept it unnaturally viscous, and the concentrate of a herb that local books described as having potent regenerative factors. After that incident where the monster had looked terribly like moss until one stepped on it took a chunk out of his leg, he could certainly vouch for it. Sure, he had never tested it on the Kitsune, but it was a far better option than just packing it with mundane gauze and hoping for the best, even given her unnatural constitution. He gently poured the gel into the gouge, to her naked interest, the extra turning into naught but mundane water once he pinched it off with his fingers. Doctors would kill for the stuff back home. Whichever companies made hydrogel dressing could eat their hearts out. Once he finished wrapping it up nicely with the extra thin cloth strips used as bandages, he scooted back, and the Kitsune rolled her kimono back down. John took a deep breath to center himself, jolting out when the Yuki quietly cleared her throat. He snapped to look up at her and saw that she was pointing at the paper that he had written on before. Nodding, he got up and grabbed a spare set of writing implements he had in the storeroom before handing it over along with a few sheets of paper. The Kitsune quickly wrote a short message before turning it over to face him. What was that medicine? It read in a smooth, clean script with nary a flaw. Now that it was an annoying question, his vocabulary is far too limited to do it justice. Even without answering questions, he'd prefer not to. It's half a solid water combined with the extra fiery shrubby sapora root, he responded, slightly annoyed that he didn't know how to indicate that it was a concentrate. Would it be the same word modified by another character or entirely different? A mild frown creased on her features, and she wrote, Do you mean? She followed by a new series of characters he didn't understand. He merely pointed at the unfamiliar string, shaking his head. I only understand, do you mean? She drew a plant entirely different from what grew in his garden. Shaking his head once more, he sketched a rough image of the actual herb that went into it, making sure to add an arrow pointing to the many tiny flowers along the long stem and labeling them red. She curiously tilted her head, adding, "Isn't that medicine weak?" "No, it was more like, is that not weak medicine?" "How is it?" More formal. "No, the roots aren't medicine. The roots have medicine. I took medicine out of many roots and put it together. And wasn't that the pain and a half? Thankfully, it boiled off to a pretty low temperature. So, if you crushed it into a fine powder, then left it in water for a while in a sealed clean container, and distilled it a few times a week later, you got something valuable." At that, she poked her ears, standing tall, and her muscles subtly tensing. She quickly scribbled, "How did you deal with the poison? There's less than the medicine, but too much can hurt." "The poison is another thing in the roots. They don't boil well," John replied, sure that sharing at least that tidbit wouldn't hurt. "The medicine boils off before the water and toxins." He sketched a quick drawing of his distilling setup below, omitting the magical heat source that made it consistent enough, and showed it to her. "You capture the boiled-off medicine and boil it more, just in case." Confusion crossed her brow as she slipped deep into thought, tension disappearing from her muscles as she settled back down. No reply was forthcoming as she stared off. "I'll be back," John wrote before standing up and walking out of the room, heading back to the main building and, more importantly, the kitchen, where he prepared a dinner of thinly sliced roast duck and steamed veggies with some ingredients from the icebox. Still, his thoughts couldn't stop swirling, even as he worked. Why did Yuki come here? It stuck in his brain like a thorn. Of course, the fact that she was operating on outdated information was almost guaranteed, but that didn't answer the question of why here. Nothing he came up with made sense. Again, unless the injury affected her worse than she let on, and he was starting to doubt that was how she stared down at him without a hint of worry as he worked. She could have decided to head to a nearby village once she saw this place was only manned by some strange creature. Unless she would not have been welcomed there. John frowned as he took the meal from the oven and the fried veggies off the stove. Now that was a heady thought. He reflected as he restarted slicing the duck, barely paying enough attention to his work. It was true that he hadn't seen anything like her amongst the villagers before, but they were xenophobic. Was there a chance it wasn't like that everywhere? Or was her society parallel, occupying much the same space but not overlapping, hidden in plain sight? Her silk-looking robes and the gold inlaid upon them pointed to a developed society capable of supporting mining for gold, dedicated clothiers with tools for making complex weaves, forming silk, and more. Well, either that, or she was some sort of disliked, distant nobility that would get torn apart down here, and, despite a lack of loyal troops, a strange monster was still a better alternative. He sighed as he went over 1,000 ways this could all go wrong, from angry mobs to pursuing monsters, different ways to mitigate, some coming to mind and others staying unanswered. Short of betraying the Kitsune, the only way out he could figure was through, and the former was off the table as far as he was concerned. Perhaps he'd even get rewarded in that case. John chuffed, shaking his head, as he scooped up an extra cotton pillow under one arm on the way out, carefully balancing a legged tray bearing plates and a mug with the other. It was no use getting hopeful before anything materialized. He might as well be happy that he was proven wrong. The air outside was chill, and softly cascading wall of grey rain loomed to the west, fast approaching. As a sharp scent of ozone rolled over him on the breeze, he hurried along to avoid soaking the bedding, sliding into the room with his offering, only to behold his guest not only ready sitting up, but meditating with crossed legs. He took a sharp breath, and the Kitsune's eyes bolted open and locked onto his, dancing like she was about to bolt up before stilling. As she drifted down to behold what he brought, she smiled before lightly nodding, shifting to a kneeling position as he dropped the bedding down and placed the tray in front of her. "My thanks," she wrote. The following few characters weren't clear to John, although he had seen them in magical maintenance guides, just not in that order. "It is very nice. Will I be staying here for the night?" "Yes. Are your wounds fine?" John replied, perhaps a bit bluntly. He paused, not sure what to call his invention outside English. "Water gauze is flexible, but I worry about tearing." Yuki's smile was gentle, like that of one talking to a child just to ask why you couldn't just turn the sun down in the summer if it was too hot. "I'll be fine. Will you be joining me for a meal?" Was it normal to eat with others in this land? It had been so long. He remembered eating meals back home, sharing dinners with long-lost friends in a dingy bar. The food was trash, yeah, but that wasn't the point. It was never the point. His lips pulled tight in nostalgic longing, washing over him before he ruthlessly crushed it deep down. He couldn't. "I'm sorry. Have a few things I have to take care of with the storm coming," he lied. "I'll be by to check on you later. Please have a good rest." The man sat her bedding amidst a storm of roiling emotions before hurrying from the room in silence and out into the rain. He was weak. It was genuinely pathetic that something that mundane bothered him. 5 years, you'd think that he'd be over it by now. Once he installed motion detectors on the workshop and main building doors, he'd have a dinner of trail mix and jerky. End of chapter. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.